right. Well, great to be with you all. I am going to do some screen sharing, which I think helps people who are visual learners sometimes to see the words, but I'll try to turn it on and off so we can also see each other's faces. So there you go. So you can now test that thing too that that Alan was telling you about, to drag the line between me and the slideshow to see if you can make the slide bigger, or you can make my face bigger as you would like. So we did our prayer already. So getting right into the book. This is a heavy book, difficult because it talks about a horrifying truth about evil and brutality. So it's hard to read. There's a lot of really hard stuff in this. One of the things that I wanted to think about before we get into conversation about it is talking about how we talk about it. And in the book, we are getting some ideas, but we're also getting a description of trauma. So those of us in the Zoom room will have different relationships to that trauma. So sometimes we're talking about ideas and we talk about that with our intellect, but sometimes we get talking about trauma or pain, or how the trauma described in the text triggers trauma or pain of our own. And so when people are sort of talking with strong emotion about their emotional reaction to the text, we listen to that in a little different way. We listen and we don't analyze it as much. So we're responding to the text both with our emotional response and also with our intellectual response, which is a bit more analytical. So when we're listening to trauma, we listen without analyzing it, and we have more of a I hear you kind of attention. If someone's talking about how painful it is for them in relation to what is in the book, again, we don't analyze it. So we can just keep that in mind and try to help each other talk in that way. So I do want to jump right into some conversation. This is our question: how do you feel having read this book? And I'm going to stop sharing just to bring up our faces so we can begin to have that initial conversation. Like, how did it feel to read this book? And if you need a couple of minutes to process that in smaller groups, we can always send you out to talk in little groups first. But Alan, you want to start us?
Well, it was heavy. It was heavy. I was familiar with some of these things, but I'm a new American. I was born in Canada. So for me, some of the details were fuzzy. So it really impacted me deeply. I liked the book, but it was heavy.
Mm-hmm.
I was reminded of a lecture I had heard at Kent State University many years ago when I was a graduate student. There was a colleague who had done research on the lynching, and she brought some of those postcards that he refers to that were mailed to families from the lynch. I had never heard of this. I mean, I knew about lynchings, but I had never heard that people went, that it was a festival, that families went, and that then they would send postcards to relatives commemorating the event. And it was one thing to hear about it, but to see the postcards and then addressed to relatives in the back was so horrifying. So this reminded me of that experience, how much closer it brings this whole issue home when you see the real thing that was shared and sent through the mail.
Mm-hmm.
Unbelievable.
Yes, yes. Thank you,
It
Irma.
was very powerful for me as well, and disturbing. But I think this thing that maybe bothers me the most is that I'm not sure have improved a lot over the time. So it just, I mean, we're doing different things. We're not lynching, but I think that's really what weighs heavy on my heart reading this book is, have we improved significantly? And I don't think we have.
Thank you, Susan. Yeah, we're going to talk about that a little bit more as we continue in with the conversation. Thomas.
Yeah, I kind of like to echo what Irma said. I mean, I was in the 60s, I was a youngster in a very conservative North Shore suburb, Glenview, and actually an unincorporated part of Glenview in the 60s, which was far more conservative than what you think of the North Shore. I mean, I would not have been surprised to see young men walking down the streets with sheets, quite frankly. But even with that, I was taken aback by the extent of what lynching was all about. I mean, I'm aware of the Emmett Tills and the main threat of it, and we've all seen the cowboy movies or the Southern movies where the bad guys are lynching one single Black person dead of night because of some perceived crime. But I had no idea, like Irma, that this was a sanctioned, festive activity. And I really did not, until I read this book, I really did not draw any parallel between crucifixion and lynching. I mean, it just knocked me off my feet. I was sitting, but it knocked me off my feet spiritually, let's say.
Yes. Yeah. Bernadette, and then Debbie next.
Of course, I have an advanced degree in Black studies, so this was really nothing new to me. But I was recalling I can't remember the author of the book. It came out recently called The Blood at the Root, where the man had moved, his family had moved down to a suburb of Atlanta. And he was amazed that there were very few Black people. And he eventually got around to researching it and discovered that at the early part of the 20th century, deliberate things like lynching, it started with a lynching of 3 people for the rape and murder of a young white woman. And then the actions just went on and on. They burnt farms until all the Black people in that community had left, getting no compensation for any of the property they left behind. And they too, it was a festival. They chose a place with like a kind of like a hollow, so that it was sort of a natural amphitheater, and built the gallows there. And hundreds of people showed up to watch. And
Thank you, Bernadette. Yeah, quite shocking. Mhm.
What,
Debbie first, and then Jerry.
okay.
Well, when I heard of lynching when I was young, I always thought it was pretty shocking, but I didn't realize that I never made the connection with the crucifixion. And also, I never realized that all these white liberals were never condemning it. And it seems like, it just makes them complicit. And is this, do you think this is because of everybody trying to smooth things over after the Civil War? And is this a vestige of that? Or they just thought they should mind their own business? Or because it just seems totally inexcusable. And the fact that this stuff still goes on, and with all this hate, it just blows my mind every day how much hate there is in this country.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Debbie. Yeah, that question of what was the cause of the white silence, we'll definitely talk about that a little more as we get in deeper. What was the cause of the white silence? Jerry, you were next.
I went on the church-sponsored trip to DC, where we attended the African American Museum of Culture and History. And in there is a photograph of, I think there are 3 Black people hanging from the noose. And there are people standing, smiling and laughing into the camera. And this book just made me remember that awful photograph, and about what if things haven't changed. Well, I think someone could argue that what happened to George Floyd was a lynching.
Yep. People, yep. Okay, Kathy next.
So I haven't quite finished the whole book. I'm a little more than halfway through with it, but what I'm most interested in is how the church reacted through all this time. I've read the book called White Too Long by Robert Jones, which goes into this about how what the church did and didn't do, and how much a part of it was. And again, it was not just hatred, it was based on power, it was based on money, which a lot of systemic racism, I think today, is still about that. So it's always fascinating to me. I was interested in the whole thing when he talked about Reinhold Niebuhr and his influence, but how what his view was, even though he basically understood prejudice and he was against prejudice, but he lived through these times of where there were still lynchings. And so I'm always amazed how the church has reacted to the Black experience, the mainstream Protestant Catholic Church.
Thank you, Kathy. Any other initial reactions to what was especially triggered for you, or what was it? How do you feel having read this book? Lucy.
Well, there was a point at which I just couldn't read any further for a while because it was so upsetting. And I'll tell you when that was. It was in the women's chapter on women. And it was the point at which they cut open the woman and the baby fell to the ground, the pregnant woman. And I just thought, okay, I can't go any further with this. It was just so devastating. So the trauma of, I don't know, I mean, I think it's because I've been a mother and I've been pregnant, you relate, but I think it's just sheer hatred. And it's hard to face it. And that was the point at which I just said, I got to take a break from this. So I just put the book down for about 5 days and picked it back up again.
It is very hard to face it. Yep. And that's one of the things that we're doing here, trying to sit in the discomfort of knowing this brutal truth, this history of ours. Irma.
Yes, I think in addition to the people smiling and the celebration, the idea that they would take parts of the body as souvenirs was just so horrifying. I mean, it really, and when you hear African Americans talk about reparations, when you read this book and put it in the context of people asking for reparations, I think you can start to understand, because this was the beginning of this century. And then this is still going on in the 30s and the 40s. It's just it's not like it was ancient history. There are people alive who experience these things. And that's, also brings it home very close, because it wasn't, before the Civil War or anything like that.
And to bring it even more in today, I mean, somebody already mentioned George Floyd, but I have heard of 4 different instances where Black men were found hanging from trees in public places. And the police have been saying these are suicides. So when you know this deeper history, you really have to question that call that it's a suicide. Because what Black man would commit suicide in that way? And there's other factors involved. Some of them are bruised as well. I believe one had his hands tied. So one of our homework pieces, I'll just tell you now, I had put it at the end, but is for all of us to research those cases of men in the last 6 months, at least 4 instances of Black men being found hanging from trees. Research that and see what the police are saying and how feasible that is. Other reactions. Jessica, go ahead.
Yeah, Nanette, to go a little bit off of that too, it sort of brought to mind like the aspect of what's the difference between like ignorance and how much do we account for that? Because just from like personal history, so I went to school in a small town in Ohio, although I'm from Chicago, and one of my good friends who is from the south side of Chicago too, received underneath his door a picture of a noose, and he's a Black man, and at the time there's a lot of like confusion about how to deal with this like act. Was it racist? Was it what was the cultural context of it? And a lot of people, I mean, and this was like, gosh, like 8 years ago now, but it's very interesting now to have this in context as well, because that sort of spurred for our college a huge racial conversation, to really put it into context of what that imagery really means and why would that be so threatening and upsetting, and why would that be chosen.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's very pertinent of like, not necessarily to say that we have to like be more per se like careful or scared, but to really, like you said, face this and really understand where we are in this conversation, and that it's still very much so ongoing and is not resolved.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it was just very, very poignant to see how things really do repeat themselves, especially if you don't know what's been done before.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, it changes how you read those threats, how you feel and think about those threats. I remember something, I don't know, maybe it was 10 years ago by now, where there was another incident where nooses were seen in trees, and I didn't understand why that was so traumatizing. I mean, I knew it was bad, but reading this book and knowing like the reality of lynching, it's so much more bad than I even knew.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Nanette, I think strangely enough, it coincided at that time. So I think it was part of like this, like a little bit of the college, like, oh, we're going to go along with whatever is happening right now in this like creepiness. But it was just that it has a very long history of actual slavery and terrorism. That's like, it's just very interesting to see how things get talked about and how they're colored. And so I appreciated too that like this book put into context that this is terrorism, and that this is something that Americans have been living with for a very long time. Mm-hmm. So that was also an interesting, unique take on it too, because usually that's only colored in a very specific context of other political events and other things that have happened in American history.
Right. Yes. Thank you, Jessica. Any other reactions? Polly, go ahead.
And it's just to follow up on her point, I think we can't discount the educational aspect of the book. I think that's very, it was very educational for me. And that's always at the root of problems, in my opinion, is the lack of awareness, the lack of education. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Kathy.
Well, Polly, to that extent, I mean, it's only been in the last 2 years that I've ever heard about, the Tulsa massacre and these other types of things that I mean, my high school was pretty small and it wasn't very, didn't have a whole lot going for it as far as academics, but still, this stuff was never taught. I mean, I think we probably spent the day on Reconstruction, maybe. Mm-hmm. So talk about education. We've never been given the chance to even address these things because it's never been written or told to us about.
Right. So how do we share this history? Yeah, and keep learning ourselves. I never knew there were Black senators within years after slavery, who, in the Reconstruction period. Go ahead, Alan.
I'm trying to unmute, sorry. I was struck by the whole courage of Ida B. Wells. I've heard of her story in general, but not the deep personal courage and the close calls that she had reporting all this out. And without her, a lot of it would probably be lost to history. So, great that she got a street name for her. That's all I really knew. I didn't know the depth of what risks she had taken.
Yes. Yep. Well, I'm going to move us along, but please do continue to share and raise your questions. It's already 7:23, which I knew that an hour would go very fast. And I had to make some choices about how conversational to be and how much I should sort of present material from the book. And it's a work in progress. I just felt like we need to take time to kind of internalize this and talk to each other about it. And so I made a lot of slides that I'm not going to show, but I am going to show a few slides and looking for a balance here. But I'm thinking that we'll mostly focus on the first chapter, actually, a little bit the introduction and the first chapter, because that is where like the foundation is laid out and we learn about lynching. And so that's kind of what's on the plan for tonight. And then if you want to send me any questions you have, or we do have that second session in December, so put your questions tonight in the chat box or send me an email, because I'll be trying to figure out at the end of this night, well, what should we do with our second night? Because we really won't be able to sort of go systematically through the book. Oh, so I'm gonna go back to screen sharing for a little bit here. So we're processing this, meaning the history of lynching, through the lens of Christian faith. So this means that we're going to need to take a look at the role of churches, the role that church leaders have played, the failure of the white church that we've mentioned a little bit already, the need for the creation of Black churches as a place of survival and resistance and resilience, the role of Black churches in that survival and resistance. And it raises questions for us about our church. How does this history reflect on us? What call to action does it place upon us? And then theologically, we'll be looking at the theology of Christ on the cross. Who is Christ to us? Who is Jesus to us? There's a womanist theologian book that I think is called the Christ of White Women's Christ, Black Women's Jesus, which reflects on how, given our racialized histories, we think of Jesus, of Christ, in different ways. So we'll just take a look at that a bit. So from the introduction of the book, Dr. Cohn writes this: until we can see the cross and the lynching tree together, until we can identify Christ with a re-crucified Black body hanging from a lynching tree, there can be no genuine understanding of Christian identity in America, and no deliverance from the brutal legacy of slavery and white supremacy. So I want to invite us to apply our critical thinking to this, in the sense of thinking, how is this true? Sometimes we think critical thinking is always about looking for how might this not be true, or where does this not line up? Sometimes critical thinking is looking analytically at something and saying, how is this true? This is a pretty radical statement, that there can be no genuine understanding of Christian identity in America without understanding the re-crucified Black body, and thinking about how this parallels the crucifixion of Jesus. So I'm going to pause and say, what do people think about that? How does understanding the history of lynching affect who we are as Christians in this country? Or how might that understanding bring us into a fuller realization of our Christian identity? That might be too heady of a question, but let's try.
Well, it's
David.
yeah. When you get the optics of a lynching, with all the material he gave us that first chapter, it's beyond imagination. There were 5,000 who had one kind of lynching or another. So that in itself is shocking. And I think the example of Niebuhr in the second second chapter is equally good. It's kind of like, okay, how does a white liberal progressive deal with this? And I just went away from that, seeing too much of myself in Niebuhr, and asked the question, where's the rage? But where's the rage? And a little bit the back and forth between Malcolm and Martin, Malcolm X and Martin. You really saw it's not that you didn't see the rage in Martin Luther King. He had a much broader audience, and he had such impact with that broader audience, but you sure saw the rage in Malcolm X. And it was frightening, to a white dominant person. It's frightening. But anyway, I think the cross and the lynching tree is just such and Cohn is himself mystified by why this connection has not been made. It's so obvious. This is the 20th century version of crucifixion. It's right here, right in front of us.
Yeah. Thank you, David. Debbie, go ahead.
Well, I frankly, I don't see how the whites who engaged in these crimes could call themselves Christian. To me, that is the antithesis of being Christian. And these people claim that they have the true Christianity. And that is so like turning everything upside down and inside out. I just can't comprehend it.
Yeah. Jessica and then Irma.
Yeah, I think speaking a little bit to what you were saying too, David, there's a way in which I think it's the reason why we haven't put that together is because there's a weird way in which we sort of forget that Jesus was a brown Palestinian Jew, and that like because of partially due to cultural influence and how then Western power Christianity, wonderful history we all know, I feel like has kind of passed down that tradition. There's a way in which like our image of God is still even conflicting, even in, I don't know, I can pose that question to everyone here of like seeing God even in ourselves, right? So how can you even start to see that in someone who seems so antithesis to you, right? And so it's sort of that like radical hospitality aspect. And then I also think too that in some ways it's partially this like paradoxical aspect to it that during slavery, like they would allow their slaves to go to church, which to me I've always thought is very paradoxical, because if anything, that's like the ultimate salvation in a situation that was like utterly hopeless. And so it was very interesting to me that it was like, okay, that they could have church, but that they couldn't have anything else, which almost is like giving you ultimate dignity while denying your humanness. Like it's almost as if it's like saying you can believe in God, but we can't believe in you as a human. So I don't know, that's something that I thought was also interestingly paradoxical as well. But yeah, so I think part of it is just that it's even hard for us to conceptualize the ways in which we also embody Jesus. And I think that's part of why that's hard, but also then at the same time, even more paradoxically difficult and crazy to think about how we could inflict that pain upon someone else. So I think it's just that it's like the black hole situation of like things falling in on each other in terms of thought. But yeah.
Yeah, it's it's interesting to think about how religion was used as a weapon too. So there was that emphasis on submit to your slave masters now, quoting that biblical text, and you'll be in heaven later. So submit, submit, submit. So used as a weapon in that way. Let's see, I called in somebody, Irma, and then Jerry.
Yeah, first of all, the connection between the lynching tree and the crucifixion is so brilliant. I had never heard anything like that before, but it is just overwhelming when you think about it, and the parallels that he draws at the beginning of the book. But the other question, I think it was Debbie who mentioned, she couldn't understand how whites who participated in this could consider themselves Christians. And although I don't want to bring in our current controversy too much, but I'm overwhelmed by the evangelical, white evangelical support for Trump and all of the things that we consider so evil about the way he has, run the government. how could it be that Christians could be so supportive, okay, and particularly evangelical Christians, of this kind of behavior? I find it hard to understand.
Mhm.
I agree. That's my question, because that's true right now.
And that's
How can all
Dr.
these
Cohn's,
people be voting for hate?
and that is Dr. Cohn's question too. Another way he puts the question is, how could whites confess and live the Christian faith and also impose 3.5 centuries of slavery and segregation upon Black people? Kathy. Oh, I called on Jerry first. Let's let Jerry go and then Kathy.
I just, there was a quote from chapter 1 that ties into what we're talking about. He says, the claim that whites had the right to control the Black population through lynching was grounded in the religious belief that America is a white nation called by God to bear witness to the superiority of white over Black.
Yes.
And, that really blew my mind too.
Mhm. They named it as part of their calling. Mhm.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh.
Kathy, go ahead.
Well, when you have back in the, what is it, the 15th century, when colonization was starting, you had this thing called the doctrine of discovery, which was basically said, white Europeans can take over any property, any land. It is our destiny to do this. It's okay to enslave indigenous people. So when you start with that, as the Europeans went down to Africa and took over lands and colonized and enslaved people, it was basically an okay. This is okay. This is, even the Pope basically agreed with this whole thing, that as long as they were spreading Christianity, it was okay to wipe out indigenous people and to do that. So right from there, you get this permission. And even though that kind of has dissipated, obviously, over time, it still underlies so much of where we are, I think.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely.
I think Susan.
Yes, Susan, go ahead.
I think that my struggle in all of this is that, you know, as you learn this and your eyes are open, and to your original question, which I don't really remember anymore, but I think it was sort of like, what's the church supposed to do? Is that I feel like what I can't do is sit and be silent anymore. And I think a lot of time Christians think they have to be nice. And I'm struggling with, how can I speak truth to people who, well, at least this new truth that I'm learning, to people who don't want to hear it. Because I think that's the answer. I just feel like we have got to open up our eyes and say, oh, we've messed up for a really long time.
Mm.
And you know, I just think being silent about it, I think a lot of white Christians are not necessarily for lynching, but they were silent about it. And that's just as bad.
Mm-hmm.
And so now that I know, I feel like I have to do something.
Yeah.
So.
I think it is interesting to think about how it functions in today's society. Where are we being silent? Where are we not seeing the depth of the anti-Black hatred? And a couple of you have kind of talked about education or the importance of knowing this history, and that's absolutely fundamental. I agree. And also, I think we need to think about how some people use power to protect power. And some people are very proactively malevolent in the way they're using their power to maintain these things, you know. So the stories in the book of Southern senators who bragged that they were the ones who managed the lynching and directed all the people what to do, like he was malevolently using his power to get people to follow along in that hatred. So I think it's important to think about, when does our passivity fit into a system of evil? And then also, how can we be organized and resist people who are actually more malevolently evil? And that's maybe in changing the systems and the laws and taking people to court and those kinds of things. Lucy, go ahead.
Well, I'm going to shift the focus a little bit back to the question that you asked, because I think what James Cone is doing here also in the book is challenging us to kind of turn our assumptions about who Jesus is and who God is upside down. So, you know, there's this phrase in liberation theology, God's preferential option for the poor. In this instance, God's preferential option for African-American people in their oppressed state. So if we could see Jesus on the cross as an African-American man getting lynched, then what does that do to us? And I think that's really the radical claim here. And it just blows us out of the water in terms of our own sense of who we are as a white church, carrying forward a particular set of assumptions about privilege and power and being able to name the story. So I think what Cone is a liberation theologian. That would be, at least he would talk about his history that way. And I think, I think that's a place where it's a pretty radical, I mean, it's a very radical claim to have to kind of look again at who Jesus was and is.
Yeah. I'm going to put that quote back up on the screen so we can all look at it. Thank you for bringing our attention back to it. Because you brought to mind another aspect of it for me, and that's this part here toward the end, where he's talking about deliverance from the brutal legacy of slavery and white supremacy. When I put that with his question, how could Christians confess to be Christians and still do this? I start to think about profession of faith. That's sort of what he means by the word confess. But it makes me think of confession too, and the role that confession plays in our faith. We talk about the importance of seeing truly who we are and what we have done so that we can confess that and be reconciled to God and to each other through that act of confession. And I think if we don't see the crucified Black bodies, if we don't see that hatred that our culture has perpetuated and is still a very big thread through contemporary life, if we can't see it, we can't confess it, and we can't be healed from it. So there's the learning about it, there's the admitting it, there's the having the bravery to name it in spaces where other people may not understand it. Those are some of the ways that I'm also thinking about this. Jerry.
What role would the church play in the education that we're talking about?
It would offer a class like this.
Well, okay, that's good. Okay.
Yep. That's the start. David, and then Irma. David, you're muted though. David, you're still muted.
There we go. I'm still thinking about Niebuhr, and it seems to me that what can the church do? I think it's about relationships. You know, because you can have an abstract view of things, as Niebuhr does, and as most of us do, but it's very different when you then have an intentional relationship with a person of another race, African American in this case, for a dominant white male. And the family. And then when you see and hear, and you do what was one of our principles from staff meeting this morning, Nanette, but you listen to understand. You listen to understand. You stay curious about their story. Then it becomes flesh and blood. Stories change lives.
That was very much in the chapter on that second chapter on Niebuhr. Yeah. Talking about how Niebuhr failed, and so many white people failed to have empathy for the suffering of the Black community and of Black individuals, so that they didn't take that seriously enough to resist it or to change it.
Yeah.
So yeah, that failure to connect human to human. Okay, well, yes, Alan.
For me, it's failure to recognize that Jesus died for all.
Mm.
You know, this notion of claiming a personal savior. Okay, Jesus died for me, and then now I can mistreat people however I feel like. Versus, we need to get the message that Jesus died for all of the world, and you cannot have faith in Jesus if you're, you know, doing these other crazy behaviors. That's my takeaway.
Yeah. I'm gonna share my screen again. Okay. So this is another quote from the introduction. Dr. Cohn wrote, "I write in it, the book, in order to start a conversation so we can explore the many ways to heal the deep wounds lynching has inflicted upon us. The cross can heal and hurt. It can be empowering and liberating, but also enslaving and oppressive." And so starting that conversation on how the church has used our faith as a weapon against different groups of people, and in this case, Black individuals. And there are ways it has been weaponized against other subsets of people too. So this conversation is a beginning, and once we have that education, we can also choose to take other actions. So we don't have time to sort of review this history of lynching, and I can tell that you all have read a lot, at least this beginning bit of the book. So I'm just going to quickly skim past all of these, and those of you who are fast readers will see all of that. This is another resource I wanted to bring to your attention, the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. Jerry, you were on the trip that went to that memorial that recognizes and memorializes victims of lynching. They have an amazing study on lynching, which is posted online, and that is available at this website at the bottom of this slide here. One section is called Back to Brutality, Restoring Racial Hierarchy Through Terror and Violence. And one of the things that they put there is talking about post-Reconstruction Southern state governments set to work altering their constitutions, their state constitutions, to disenfranchise Black citizens and codify segregation. So we had just added the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. We had said Black people are citizens, Black men can vote. No women could vote at that time. So when you have this federal situation, the states began to create new laws, and this is where we started getting poll taxes and literacy exams. Yesterday, I watched the documentary about Stacey Abrams, or put together by Stacey Abrams, and they go through a little bit of this history too. One of the lawyers testifies that he and some of his second-year law school students tried to take the literacy test and they couldn't pass it. Second-year law students. So, you know, as we know, those were just putting obstacles in place to try to prevent people from voting. This feels so timely, of course. This drawing here is from Harper's Weekly, 1868, and you see it said, the description is one vote less. One more dead man, one vote less. So we have changed in many ways, and yet we see people still trying to alter the rules and the laws in order to limit the vote. So it's something that we need to continue to examine. The reorganization of white supremacy, we could call this. I did not know, and only recently learned a few months ago, that in some of the southern states during slavery, fully one half of the population of that state was enslaved to the other half of that population. So when that other half suddenly has the power to vote, that's how we get Black senators during Reconstruction. So check out this documentary with Stacey Abrams. I think it's called All In on Netflix right at the moment. So,
And Nanette,
yeah, go ahead,
it was
jump in.
also, you know, the whole other part of that situation was that southern states wanted to keep slavery because that also gave them more power in Congress. Because even though you couldn't, Black people couldn't vote, the people that owned them, they counted as people. So on a representative basis, those states got more representatives in Congress because of slavery, because they owned slaves.
Right.
So when that changed and they could no longer do that, and whites were seeing that Black people were getting in, they were voting for Black people. It was like, well, we can't, what do we do to stop this? Because we're going to be out, because there's, at this point, in some areas, there's more Blacks than whites.
Right, right. So the hatred is very tied to power and maintaining white power and the power of the people who have the power. Yeah. Well, we're getting into the role of churches a little bit. So I'll just throw up a couple of quick slides, getting toward the end of our time. We've talked about the spectacle lynchings and how the crucifixion was also something that happened for an audience. Crucifixions were for the purpose of the audience seeing the crucifixion. And we see that also in the lynchings, another similarity there. But Cohn rightly points out they could not have happened without the widespread knowledge and the explicit sanction of local and state authorities, and with the tacit approval from the federal government, the members of the white media, churches, and universities. So this is where we start to get into the role of the churches. So this figure is shocking: 10 to 20,000 men, women, and children coming to the event, and women and children given the first opportunity to torture the victims. Horrifying. So the white churches, thinking about how they responded. The silence, we've named that already. Whites being unmoved by Black suffering. So not identifying, strongly disidentifying with them over there and staying distant from their pain. The sense of white superiority, also known as white supremacy. And what I mean by this is this sense that the way that the stereotypes were used to give the sense that Black victims deserved their suffering because actually they were monsters, actually they were rapists, actually they were very bad. So white people are superior, we have the power, we're good, Black people deserve this suffering. And the churches reiterated that. So here's where I wanted to reiterate the whole conscious, unconscious protection of white power, because even the white people who were buying into these stereotypes and these ideas were protecting white power, their power. They weren't malevolently going and finding innocent people to torture, but they were believing that the innocent victims were somehow deserving. And yet that those malevolent conscious players, I think we need to look at both and think about the different forms of evil and how evil functions in us too, in some of those unconscious ways when we ourselves remain silent or don't take the time to get to know people or walk a mile in their shoes or care about the suffering that other people are experiencing. So, I think I'll throw out a couple of more slides just to get to the second half of the chapter, because then Colin starts to talk about resistance. So we have all of this very hard stuff about the suffering and the victimization. So his other question was, how did Southern rural Blacks survive the terrors of this era? Self-defense and protests were out of the question because it was so, any protest or self-defense would just lead to another murder. But there were other forms of resistance. So he talked about most Blacks using blues or religion as chief weapons of resistance. So this is his quote: Blacks found hope in the music itself, a collective self-transcendent meaning in the singing, dancing, loving, and laughing. They found hope in the stoic determination not to be defeated by the pain and suffering in their lives. James Baldwin called this hope an ironic tenacity. So the Black churches, which were founded because people were not welcome in the white churches and could not be healed in the white churches. So I loved this description of what happened in church. Our churches are where we dip our tired bodies in cool springs of hope, wrote Richard Wright in 12 Million Voices, a place where we retain our wholeness and humanity despite the blows of death. And he said, our going to church on Sunday is like placing our ear to another's chest to hear the unquenchable murmur of the human heart. So my question for us to think about is, for Fourth Church, historically predominantly a white church, can we become this kind of church, where we are a place where people come to our church to listen to that unquenchable murmur of the human heart, where people feel fully welcome and embraced, where it feels like there's hope surrounding them and it's not another place where they're not seen, not valued. We have some challenges to get to that place, but I think it's significant that people had to go to Black churches to get that in the past. So we just have about 6 minutes, and I want to open it up for any reflections and thoughts. I do have a recording of Billie Holiday singing Strange Fruit from 1959 that I'd like to play at the end. So Jerry, were you raising your hand?
Yeah, I've always loved Negro spirituals, and I even love them more having read the book and to see how important they were to the Blacks when they were undergoing all this awful stuff. So I love them.
Mm-hmm. Susan.
Yeah, when I was reading that about the music, I was, I felt like the spirituals and the blues, and I think the jazz and the rap followed that pattern. It's a way that they can speak, that they can speak to each other almost on it, that we maybe don't get. And I was thinking with the spirituals, like you said, Jerry, how I love the spirituals, but it made me realize that I probably, it isn't probably as deep in me as it is for them, because, it really speaks to them. And I'm not in their shoes, but that's a way to try to build my empathy. Besides whoever said this, I think it was David, is relationships, which has been a real goal of mine, is just being in friendships with people that are different than me. Because when you have a face and you love that face, then everything becomes different, right?
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Susan. Other thoughts? Jessica.
Yeah, to piggyback off of that, I think maybe it can be an invitation that we have a conversation with someone that we might not have thought that we would have a conversation with, that maybe talks about this. I know it's difficult to sort of straddle that line between being look at this horrific thing and being didactic about it at the same time. But given that we're in a situation where there's a lot of division, and I think a lot of healing could come from just thinking about differences, like I think exactly like what you're saying, Susan, of like empathy. It's like all of us have moments when we felt different or outside. Like it can be anything from like remembering back to when we were like young and on the playground to like just awkward conversations in like the office. You know, like there's just times when we just don't feel like we're like everyone else. And I think that is just like the where to start, because church is where everyone's welcome, even though sometimes actions definitely belie differently. But maybe that's something that we could try and do. And then, I don't know, I know Nanette, you said we're doing another conversation in December, and maybe we could talk about how those conversations went. Hopefully they're positive. But regardless, I think it's sort of like, I don't know, I feel like this is the season of my life, sort of like falling in love. It's like, it's not the fact of whether or not it actually ended in whatever happy ending you expected. It's the fact that you tried.
Yeah. I think as we think about reaching out and befriending people who are different from us, to remember to think about them as just like us. Like we don't necessarily need to process history with them or make their life about that history. They might want to talk about what movie they're watching, just like we might want to. So to kind of keep it in that like humanizing realm of befriending people and finding out what's important to them. Yeah, I like it, Jessica. Irma.
Yeah, I think just a little caution in terms of building relationships. I used to know a lot of people in another church that I attended in Ohio, which were one-on-one wonderful people, very friendly, outgoing, very social, coffee hours, etc. But when it came to voting on certain issues, they would not vote the way I thought they should. Okay, in terms of, whether raising taxes for our school district, or whether, spending more money on food stamps or those kinds of policies. So I think it's really important as we think about, building relationships one-on-one, that we go beyond that, because we're talking about structures, that it's not just an issue of, my getting along with other people, but what are the structures that control the power and our behavior. And I'm thinking of one example that always bothers me when I go to our church. There's a gentleman many of you may have seen. He sits in a wheelchair, generally by the side entrance, with a cup, and people, put $1 in there. And sometimes they have their children put $1 in there, and he will give them a lollipop. And the people are very nice, and they're very nice to him. And the children, and they're teaching the children about charity. But I sometimes wonder how many of those people vote in a way that affirms, open housing or whatever other issues we're voting on in our city or our state or nation, or do they take a fairly conservative position? They're good with charity one-on-one and sweet, outgoing, etc., but they can't see the connection between policy that affects many people and, their nice gestures one-on-one.
Yeah, you raise the point of, it's not just about relationship, it's not just about biases, but it's about policies and power that affect people's lives. Well, we're at our 8 o'clock time. I would like to play this music for those of you who can stay. And this is, and then I hope that you'll come back and join us on the first Tuesday of December. So we'll have a second conversation about this book. And if you have thoughts, things you want to talk about. I see Jerry put a question in the chat. What does re-crucified mean? I'll add that to my list of questions. Maybe we can address it more deeply next time. Send me your thoughts or ideas of angles you want to pursue, and we'll pick this up in a month. So
you'll send us a reminder. Yeah.
Somebody will send a reminder about the class.
Okay.
Yes. Let's see. I have to.
Yeah, Michael's pretty good about that.
Yeah, Michael Mirza is the assistant for adult ed, and he'd be happy. He'll make sure that all of you receive an invitation, and maybe we'll even get a few more folks to join us.
Okay, I'm going to YouTube to get this video to share with you. So I wanted to say that Billie Holiday sang this song for over 20 years. And so there's a recording, an audio recording of her singing it in 1939 or so. And I listened to that. There's no visual of that recording. This recording in 1959 is after singing the song for 20 years, and we get to see her expression while she sings it. It's very powerful, expressing the trauma that she's trying to reflect by sharing this.
Southern trees bear strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root, black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees. Pastoral scene of the gallant South, the bulging eyes and the twisted mouth, scent of magnolia, sweet and fresh. Then the sudden smell of burning flesh. Here is a fruit for the crows to pluck, for the rain to gather, for the wind to suck, for the sun to rock, for the tree to drop. Here is a strange and bitter cry.
Wow.
Wow. Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Share a quick little story. I worked for several years in coaching high school kids and teach in jazz, and one of the students came to me once and wanted to sing that, and I consulted with the other teachers, and we decided that probably wasn't a good song for this student to sing. And I sort of didn't know exactly how to go there on that. Again, it was the Black teachers that made the decision. So anyway, it has a big effect on Black people, that's for sure, and on me.
Music is so powerful.
Yeah.
Alan, I would like to close this in prayer. Do you need to say anything else?
Good. Just remember, same time, same channel, 7 o'clock, 1st of December.
First Tuesday of December. Let's pray. Oh, holy God, you are with us at all times and in all places. You have been with us as Christ on the cross, suffering unimaginably. You, God, you know the depth of human depravity and evil. And even having entered into that, you have brought us through. And you can bring us through whatever the world gives us. Be with us now. Help us as we name and confront evil. Make us strong and give us clear resolve to hear the truth and to tell the truth and to love each other while we do it. In the name of Christ, we call upon you, and in the name of Christ, we depend on you. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Nanette.
Thank you.
Amen. Thank you. Nanette.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye. Have a good
Very
night.
good.
Time.
Goodbye.
Yep. Thanks.
Care.